at an arsenal in Maryland.
The Germans fought back in America by waging a covert campaign of sabotage in munitions factories and at ports where ships loaded weapons bound for Britain and France.
In 1916, a huge amount of ammunition on Black Tom Island off Caven Point blew up with a blast that broke practically every window in Jersey City and in downtown New York. It was a gigantic explosion that lasted almost all night.
By 1917, despite the propaganda and all the financial and military support the United States was giving the Allies, Britain was on the verge of bankruptcy.
1917 was the tough year. The British authorities, by the end of 1916, were deeply concerned that they were scraping the bottom of the barrel of their financial resources.
The Allies were in danger of collapse. They needed soldiers fast. Secretly, Woodrow Wilson was planning America's entry into the war. Americans had no idea of what was to come. In 1916, Britain and France were struggling to hold the Western Front against Germany. Meanwhile, in America, Woodrow Wilson was a vulnerable president. In 1912, he had won a three-way race with only 42% of the vote. Now, he was re-elected president by a razor-thin margin on an anti-war platform.
Woodrow Wilson ran in 1916 for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," which wasn't the slogan he had favored. He really wanted to run on his domestic record. The 8-hour day, child labor laws, a restriction of big business, the so-called trusts.
In his first term and during the campaign, Wilson had condemned all the warring nations and called on them to negotiate a peace without victory. The stories from the battlefield horrified the average American. This was trench warfare, with each side dug in, facing each other. An assault was the only way to break the lines, but the machine guns were waiting. The most fearsome weapon of all was gas.
Gas was first used on the Western Front in the spring of 1915. The gas was chlorine, kind of a primitive form of gas. It was an asphyxiant. But of course, the troops who were opposing them, French colonials and Canadians, were not prepared for it. They had to improvise, and they just barely held on. And if the Germans had had sufficient troops to follow up, there might have been a major breakthrough. This triggered a gas war.
Over 9 million soldiers would die before the war was over. Americans were appalled by the mechanized carnage, but many also felt they must take sides.
Wilson's view of the war during his first term was it was a nightmare on both sides. He saw nothing to differentiate the morality of the British and the morality of the Germans.
But secretly, Wilson was pro-British. His mother was English, and he had visited England. He harbored deep suspicions of the German government.
He wanted Britain to win, but he also wanted the U.S. to stay out of it, which was not seen as a contradiction at the time. That was the most popular view among the different views of war in the United States at the time.
Wilson's Democratic Party was filled with anti-war sentiment. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan constantly warned Wilson that Wall Street would drag America into the war. At its convention in Baltimore, the party adopted the slogan, "He kept us out of war," for Wilson's re-election campaign. The Republicans were the party of war. They raged over German submarine attacks on US ships in the Atlantic, like that on the Lusitania in 1915, in which 128 Americans died.
The Republican Party tended to be more belligerent. Some of its leading figures, for example, former President Theodore Roosevelt detested Wilson.
In January 1917, President Woodrow Wilson was still saying that the US would stay out of the war, but Americans were in harm's way on the high seas.
President Wilson makes his Peace Without Victory speech on January 22nd, 1917. It's his last attempt to avoid a war, but then events take a bad turn for his vision. The first thing that happens is the Germans instantly resume using the submarine warfare, and they start shooting at ships, including ships that include American passengers.
Famous director Cecil B. DeMille portrayed incidents like these in his 1917 film, The Little American, fanning the flames of war. That same month, in the infamous Zimmermann telegram, the German government offered an alliance to Mexico. It dangled the possibility of regaining Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico as bait. Britain intercepted the telegram, decoded it, and gave it to Wilson. He was particularly angry because he had allowed the German embassy to use communication lines from Washington to send coded messages to Berlin.
They've gone to Wilson and said, we can't communicate normally because the British have cut our communications. Can we please use your State Department channels? And Wilson says, yeah, sure. And what are they doing? They're sending messages offering an alliance to Mexico to attack us through the same channel.
On the 2nd of April 1917, just 5 months after his re-election, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. Despite opposition from his own party, Wilson carried the day and Congress declared war on Germany. America was now at war, but both the nation and its president were naive about what was to come.
Woodrow Wilson wasn't aware of how badly the Allies were doing. They had been fairly successful at hiding it. Britain successfully hid its financial problems for the most part until after the American declaration of war.
Neither the president nor the public had any idea how desperate Britain and France were, nor how many American troops would be needed in Europe. The American military was also unprepared. The war in Europe would challenge the American Republic at home. In April 1917, building on Britain's secret propaganda effort, America declared war on Germany. Woodrow Wilson was now a war president, but neither he nor his administration had a war plan. In fact,